Hello and welcome to episode 31 of Crime Stories Sunday. In this episode, we're going to 1967 and the small Suffolk town of Tattingstone. Suffolk is a county in the south of England. On this chilling day, the 16th of January 1967, a farm worker discovered 2 suitcases dumped in a field. Inside was the body of a teenage boy, expertly carved into 8 pieces. Grisly, yeah. But the media called this a look into the twilight world of perverts. This is the case of Bernard Oliver. Bernard Oliver was born in 1950. He was the 4th of 6 children born to his parents George and Sheila. His only sister was the eldest child, Maureen, and then his 4 brothers were Andrew, Philip, Chris and Tony. Chris and Tony, his younger brothers, were only 15 and 13 when Bernard disappeared. At the time of his disappearance, Bernard was living in Muswell Hill in North London with George, his father, and his siblings. The parents had separated about a year earlier. His childhood was happy. He enjoyed walking the family dog, a poodle called Pepe, and was described by his family as very gentle and friendly. They'd often go scrumping for apples, riding bikes, or running about in the woods as little boys do with their dog. And they were a close family. Bernard was known to many people. He had many friends. He was sociable, but none of them were as close as he was to his brothers. He enjoyed his alone time. But at the same time, he was just a friendly guy, a friendly young man. At the age of 17, he'd left school and he was working in a warehouse. His brother described him as small for his age, about 5'3", of slim build, and he could have easily been mistaken for a younger boy. Also, he had some learning difficulties, which perhaps made him come across as younger mentally than 17, but also perhaps it made him a little bit too trusting. So Bernard was last seen by his family on the 6th of January 1967. It was a Friday night. He'd gone out with his friends, as he sometimes did, but when he wasn't home in the morning, which never happened, George was very concerned and he called the police. So an investigation began into the disappearance of 17-year-old Bernard Oliver. Now, this is the time before CCTV, before cell phones and the capacity to track phone pings and text message trails, and even the ability to collect DNA from a crime scene. Detectives had little to go on. That is, until 10 days later, on the 16th of January, and a farm worker just going about his everyday business in the small town of Tattingstone, which is in Suffolk, quite close to the port of Ipswich. And this is about 80 miles northeast of Muswell Hill, where Bernard Oliver lived and was last seen. The farm worker opened one of the suitcases and inside were body parts. Just a gruesome scene. And according to local media at the time, it took this poor man almost an hour to compose himself enough to make his way to the phone box and call the police. Now, Tattingstone was a very small town, not much more than a village, really, and the news soon spread about the gruesome discovery. It became clear that this was certainly the most horrific murder that Tattingstone had ever seen, but it also became the scene of one of the darkest murders in Britain's history. When police first got to the scene on the field, they hit an immediate block. They had no way to identify this expertly chopped up body. And this is why they took the controversial and highly unusual, bizarre step of instructing a local funeral worker to dress up the decapitated head, like the head that was just sitting there in this suitcase, by propping open the eyes, cleaning him up, and taking photographs of him that they would then circulate to the British media. It was the only way they had of ever hoping to identify this body. And this severed head, in my opinion, looks alive, if not with a very blank kind of stare into the distance, but still, it looks alive. But this picture was printed in any newspaper whose editor was brave enough to run it. It's still gory, but it's only shocking when you realise that this is murder victim Bernard Oliver. But this tactic worked, and it was Bernard's family who saw the picture. They contacted the police, and the body had a name. And this is one clip from the Times newspaper. Suitcase boy victim is named. The boy in the suitcase victim was named earlier this morning as Bernard Michael Oliver, aged 17, a warehouse lad of Steeds Road, Muswell Hill in North London. He'd been missing from his home for about 11 days. It was actually 10 days. Oliver's dismembered body was found in 2 suitcases in Tattingstone, Suffolk. Detectives visited a cottage in the village near Tattingstone after reports of parties there involving seamen, the police said yesterday. Superintendent Harry Tappin, leading the murder inquiry, came to London from Ipswich last night. So this wasn't too far from the port of Ipswich. So it's interesting. A party involving seamen was mentioned in the early days. This is from the 20th of January. You see, there have been sightings of Bernard after his disappearance, and the results of the autopsy were very interesting. But we'll get to that. Let's talk about these suitcases first. So although detectives had very little to go on, apart from now they had a name and they know that he was from North London and that he'd been missing about 10 days. So they had this 10-day time frame to fill. The only other major clue that they had were the suitcases themselves. So one of them was like a grey colour, and one of them was lighter, like a cream colour. But there were letters painted on one of the suitcases in between the clasps, and it said PVA. So the curious detectives couldn't work out what PVA stood for. But then inside one of the suitcases was a small towel. There was a laundry mark on this towel, and it said QL42. These were marks that were put on items that would help the launderette return the item back to its owner after it had been cleaned. Again, detectives knew that that was relevant in some way, but they couldn't work out what it meant. But let's talk about the autopsy. Bernard was found in 8 pieces that had been expertly carved. Somebody had not just hacked away at this body. They had the ability and also the tools in which to slice this body neatly into pieces. Bernard was found naked. There were signs of sexual assault. All his clothes were missing, apart from one single item, a neatly folded sports jacket, which his family said, yes, that's Bernard's jacket. That's what he was wearing when he went out. In the pocket of that jacket was a matchbox, box of matches, which were from a brand of matches marketed in Israel. So nothing else about that has been made public, to my knowledge. We don't know whether they were burners matches, whether he was a smoker or not, but those were in the coat pocket. Also, it was revealed that Bernard's stomach had food inside it, and this was a recently consumed meal. So if Bernard had been murdered on the night that he disappeared, the 6th of January, he'd recently eaten a meal and then not had time to digest it. But no, there were other signs on this body that the death had occurred less than 48 hours ago. So he wasn't murdered on the night he disappeared. He'd actually been alive for at least 8 days. So where was he for those 8 days? Detectives now had an 8-day time frame in which Bernard was alive. So where was he? Bizarrely, also, the medical examiner made note that it looked like that Bernard had very neatly manicured nails. There'd been no signs of a struggle, and his nails had been manicured. So had his nails, and also his hair was freshly cut. Had he had his nails done and his hair done while he was alive? Or did the killer do that after he was dead? We don't know. But detectives set about trying to find as many witnesses as possible. They'd already been doing interviews and things in Muswell Hill, but Bernard, it looks like, was 80 miles away, at least for some of that time that he was alive for 8 days. There were witnesses in Tattingstone. One witness, a woman, says that she'd seen a middle-aged man on the night the body was dumped. So the body was found on the 16th, so the night before, so that would have been the 15th into the 16th, wearing a dark trilby hat and a long trench coat, walking in the direction of Tattingstone. So just outside of Tattingstone, walking in. This man, she gave a description of, and a sketch was made, and this man was carrying a suitcase. Now, there was another witness, a man, who reported that he'd seen 2 unattended suitcases and a man wearing medical gloves near to Ipswich docks days before Bernard's body was found. So why would there have been a man wearing medical gloves, like latex gloves, at the docks? In 1977, so this is 10 years after Bernard's murder, this private investigator claimed to recognise the suitcase, the one with the initials PVA on it, as belonging to 3 men who used a laundrette in Muswell Hill. So that could explain the laundry mark on the towel. Now, the private investigator started naming names, and it just so happened that the names he named were already suspects, and we'll get into those shortly. Until this PI spoke up after doing his own investigations, it had been all but closed, but it was reopened, and it was reopened with some vigour. And the case has gone through this. It's gone through this kind of, long years of a lull and then a flurry of attention. There was a new turn in 2018. So remember, this happened in 1967. This is years later. A local woman came forward, now in her 60s, and said she'd seen Bernard Oliver in the village of Tattingstone, very much alive. So she said that she was 16 at the time. She worked exercising horses for the local huntsman. And on this particular morning, she'd been out riding the horses up the hills just outside of Tattingstone. And she saw a young man. He was carrying 2 suitcases. He was someone she'd not seen before, and his face was covered in freckles. Now, Bernard did have freckles on his face and a number of kind of small moles that at a distance would look like freckles. In those days, Tattingstone was a very small village. It's still very small. There's still only several hundred people live there. And, she said you got to recognise all the regulars and all the local people, and he wasn't one of them. And then a few days later, she saw his photograph in the paper and thought, oh my God, that's the chap. So that picture of the head. But yet she didn't come forward until 2018, which is weird. And it was her daughter that had persuaded her to come forward. Maybe she didn't want any kind of notoriety. I don't know. But those are the witnesses. So we know Bernard was alive for 8 days. And then we also know that he was likely in Tattingstone, not in London, for at least some of that time. So how had he got there? Who had he gone with? Is the question. Now, there's a whole bunch of suspects, but there are 2 main suspects, 2 doctors who certainly did have the capacity to chop up a body in a way that looked expert. And these doctors were paedophiles. These doctors had been accused. There were cases against them. So it's these 2 doctors that are the prime suspects. But who were they connected to is another question. These 2 doctors, this is revealed from documents made public in 2004. Both of these doctors were amongst the 2,000 people interviewed over the years up to 2004 in the Bernard Oliver inquiry. Sadly, though, both deceased. And they took any secrets that they had about Bernard's murder to their graves. One had died in 1995. He had a surgery in Muswell Hill, close to where Bernard lived. Before Bernard disappeared, he fled from London in 1965 to South Africa because he was facing arrest on sex charges. But he kept coming back to the UK and evading the police. The second suspect committed suicide in 1975. He left some notes behind, not that mentioned Bernard's murder specifically. Intriguing, nonetheless. All right, so who are these prime suspects? All right, well, Dr. John Biles, who is a former ship's surgeon, found dead at the age of 38 in a bedroom in the Prince of Wales Hotel in northern Queensland on January 19th, 1975. Now listen, this is January 19th, so that's 3 days after the, I should say, anniversary, or the day that Bernard was found dead, the 16th of January. I don't know whether that's relevant or not. I don't know. But it was right around the 8th anniversary. At the time of his death, he was wanted for extradition to England. He was thought to be part of the Holy Trinity paedophile ring. Amongst allegations made against Dr. Biles was that he invited boys and teenagers to his surgery, gave them alcohol, got them intoxicated, and then persuaded them to commit indecent acts. He took photographs of them and then sold them to pornographers in Denmark. So this is an international paedophile ring operating from London in the 1960s. Following Dr. Biles' death, Suffolk police were told that he'd once admitted to murdering a cabin boy and cutting up his body. So a cabin boy as in somebody working on a ship. So this is hearsay, obviously, but had he done that before to a cabin boy? Was he referring to Bernard? We don't know. But these suicide notes, right, that were found beside his body in that Australian hotel room, one of them was addressed to Scotland Yard, like the place of the Metropolitan Police in London, apologising, but not saying what for. One to his family and one to another doctor, believed to be Martin Reddington. Well, Dr. Martin Reddington, who is he? Well, in February 1977, Dr. Reddington was charged at the Central Court in Sydney, Australia, for committing sexual assault on a young man. Now, he died in 1995 at the age of 63 in Surrey, not too far from Suffolk. Had previously had a surgery in Muswell Hill, close to where Bernard lived. The premises actually were in the direction of the street that Bernard Oliver was last seen walking down to go and see his friends. 2 years before Bernard's murder, an arrest warrant was issued for Dr. Reddington on charges of sexual assault on males. And that's the time when he fled to South Africa. But he kept coming back to the UK. And police never caught him. He'd just go abroad and then keep coming back. Why was he coming back? Because he was involved in something, right? Reddington was one of the doctors that this private investigator from 1977 named as using a laundrette in Muswell Hill, and potentially why that towel had a laundry mark. Police had deemed that although these two were prime suspects, there wasn't enough to charge them with Bernard's murder. But when court records were released, it became clear that they were both jointly wanted for a string of crimes, including another murder of a young boy in London in 1973. For me, I think those two guys did it. What took them to Tattingstone, though, I don't know. But there were other suspects. Roger and Reggie Cray, the Cray twins, had also been implicated in this murder. You know, these guys were gangsters, and I don't know whether this is true or not. This comes from a former cellmate of Reggie Cray. I never quite believe these jailhouse stories from people, but I don't know. Apparently Reggie Cray had confessed to killing a young boy. Was it Bernard? I don't know. But it's interesting that these gangsters did have links to Suffolk. They'd been sent there as evacuees, as children, in World War II, and they'd actually had a house in the nearby village of Bilderston at the time of Bernard's murder. So two of Bernard's younger brothers, Chris and Tony, believe that the Crays had something to do with it, but I don't know. According to Chris and Tony, they say that the Crays used to go to this particular house in Suffolk with male prostitutes. Maybe they invited Bernard there, gave him money. But there's also links to the music industry as well. What about record producer Joe Meek? He's known as a pioneer in pop music in the 1960s. Just 2.5 weeks after Bernard's body was discovered, on the 3rd of February 1967, Meek shot his landlady before turning the gun on himself. And apparently in his final days, he developed paranoia. He was in some kind of acute mental health crisis. He was claiming that his walls had been bugged with hidden microphones. He was fearing being interviewed by the police in relation to the Tattingstone Suitcase murder, Bernard Oliver. There's also another music person who has been linked, and this is DJ Tony Windsor. And in the 60s, he worked on the Galaxy, a ship in which pirate radio station Radio London was broadcast. The ship was harboured off the coast around 12 miles away from Tattingstone. And multiple sources have confirmed that police boarded the ship early in February, just days after Meek killed himself and his landlady, which in turn was only 2 weeks after Bernard's murder. And then the radio station, Radio London, days after, like on the 7th of February, they fired him. And they said it was because he had an alcohol problem. And he was an alcoholic. However, in an interview in 2018 with Sky News, Murray Payne, who was the director of Radio London, said that it was mainly Tony Windsor at the time who was the main interest in Bernard's murder. Close friend of Joe Meek in the general vicinity. Remember the witness who saw someone in medical gloves at Ipswich Docks? But Murray Payne went on to say, it's all horribly sleazy, very sad that someone who has for so long got away with murdering this poor kid. There was also a Dutch ship that was in the vicinity. You remember the party at the house? This Dutch crew came off a ship at Ipswich immediately before the murder took place. Never found out who they were, but still, I don't know, guys. The murder of Bernard Oliver is still unsolved, and it's currently in the hands of Suffolk Police's cold case team. And periodically there's renewed appeals for information. 2022 there was a review of the evidence that apparently has been concluded, but we don't know whether anything has come of that. Nothing's certainly become public anyway. Anyhow, anyone with information on the murder of Bernard Oliver can contact the Major Crime Review and Unsolved Case Manager, Andy Guy, by emailing unsolved case reviews, all one word, at norfolk.pnn.police.uk. Honestly, I think it's the doctors, but I think they had links with paedophile rings, and I think Bernard was lured to Suffolk, maybe with money, maybe with the promise of, I don't know, fame and fortune or something like that, and something bad happened. I think he perhaps maybe was consenting at first and something bad happened and he was murdered. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I've been Michelle, hope you're well, and I'll see you in the next episode of Crime Stories Sunday. Bye, guys.